Hi all, I wish to cover the final game of Fischer's conquest of the US Championship in 1963, where he had 11-0 clean sweep. So he faced Anthony Saidy in the last round, who played c4, the English opening, and he played symmetrically. After knight f3 he played knight c6, and now Saidy opened up the centre with d4, potentially to avoid Fischer binding the d4 square with e5 say. Fischer now took on d4 and played knight f6, and after knight c3 he showed again that he didn't mind playing with the isolated queen pawn. He played e6 with the idea later of playing d5. Now Saidy played a non-stereotypical move. He played actually knight Nb5, eyeing this d6 square. Fischer didn't mind white playing potentially knight d6 check here, as maybe king e7 is fine for black with a lead in development, followed by say queen a5. Saidy though played a3, so he wanted to get the two bishops away from Fischer. Fischer obliged. Bishop takes c3 and knight takes c3 was played, and now d5. So Fischer doesn't mind white playing to give black an isolated pawn. You'll note though that the bishop on c8 is liberated and can come out later to either f5 or g4. So the compensation is there, and there's also a slight lead in development. So black's position is perfectly playable. After bishop f5, white now tried to secure the advance of black playing d4 by playing knight b5 now to reroute d4. After queen b6, white played castles, and Fischer played a6, tempting white just to block the pawn, because this change in pawn structure is perfectly okay for black. The isolated pawn is now less of an exploitable weakness, and in fact is not an isolated pawn now. It's just we have a symmetrical pawn structure, which should in theory increase the drawing chances. The way Fischer played it though, he put white under incredible pressure later in the ending, as we'll see. First he didn't mind exchanging off these bishops, and now black was able to use the c-file to reach a comfortable knight versus bishop ending, where white's d4 pawn is more of a problem actually than black's d5 pawn. Note though that white has a dark square bishop and this is a pawn on a light square. So we'll see now some instructive play from Fischer. First rerouting the knight to the e6 square to probe that d4, try and tie white down to it. Now this next plan is to get the king out aggressively. Fischer does this with h5, so we'll see the king coming now to either f5 or to g6 if he chooses. He actually first goes to f5 and now lets this f pawn come up later with f5, as we'll see now, because this is a way of squeezing to gain more space on this king side, which actually has an effect of causing both structural damage in white's position and also more entry points for the black king. You'll see in this kind of pawn structure that the black king couldn't progress any further, so Fischer ingeniously soon sacrifices a pawn now with g4 temporarily, because it creates an entry point for the black king on the king side. That g4 point is now an entry point, with black king always threatening to say go to g3, and there's a lot of endings which will be better now for black, or even winning. If for example after knight g3 check bishop takes g3 was played, this would be a completely winning ending for black. For example, king takes g3 and now a5 to cause a zugzwang move, because the king can't move back to either e1 or e2, and this king and pawn ending simply winning because black comes and sweeps up this d pawn. So white has a lot of losing chances all of a sudden because of this black king being so aggressive and white having to look after two weaknesses here. After knight g3 white played king d3, and after knight f5 white is actually already clearly in trouble, because now there's the threat of knight h4 harassing that g2 pawn. So white actually may have lost the plot already here because of an inaccurate move. After bishop f2, knight h4, white ends up losing that g2 pawn because that king and pawn ending would be lost, and after this it was easy for Fischer just to bring his king to e2 and herd the pawn. So in the final position, knight e3, white resigned. Let's have a quick overview and summary of this game and look briefly at where white might have improved that ending, and then can make some final remarks about this achievement of 11 straight victories in a row. The opening was a symmetrical English with an early d4. Fischer prepared to accept the isolated queen pawn. He used his strong pressure to first dissolve the weakness in effect of that isolated d-pawn with this pawn structure change. So the isolated pawn cannot be attacked frontally. It's fine, it's a symmetrical pawn structure now. Fischer got rid of White's light squared bishop and didn't mind the exchanges of rooks because this ending was more comfortable for black. He proved that by first pressurizing this d4 pawn and then bringing his king out aggressively, and later squeezing now on the king side with his pawns to cause structural damage and create entry point for his king on the g4 square. So this temporary pawn sacrifice was used with decisive effect. Bishop e1 may have been the key decisive mistake here. Maybe a5, for example, knight f2 check, king e2, and the knight wouldn't be so bad on e4, believe it or not, even though optically it looks very good. If White has bishop e1 and is able to cover the entry points, this might have been a draw. However, the way White played it, White ended up losing the g-pawn, and after that it was just easy. So Fischer won the g-pawn, and then after knight e3, White resigned. The achievement was remarkable. It was the first time ever someone had wiped out a field of grandmasters with 11 straight wins. So it was one of Fischer's defining moments in chess history, in particular US chess history. I believe he'd also won it more times than Rzewski. He'd won it at least 7 times, the US Championship, but never so convincingly. I hope you enjoyed this series of annotations of Fischer's 11-0 clean sweep. I may move on to other champions such as Karpov and Kasparov and their famous tournaments. In particular, I'm interested in looking at Tilburg, but if you have any suggestions, please leave them on YouTube, and I may annotate them in the future. Thanks for listening, and see you later.